Well, let's look at informational text. And you have this on, I gave you the handout, but this is in the book, and this is a second grade example. I know this lesson because I did this lesson, okay? I was sort of the teacher here. And I put kids in groups, and I said, we're going to be reading about the bones in the body, because in this second grade kids class, I won't tell you where it is yet, they were reading about the human anatomy and bones in their science class. And they got together and they talked about what they knew about their bones. And I walked around and chatted with them. They were in working groups and so on. And then I said, let's get together. It took about 5 minutes. And I say, so what do we know about bones in our body? And Charlie says, we talked about how bones break sometimes. And I said, and? And Charlie said, you put it in a cast, you have to wear the cast for a long time. And I began to get a sense that maybe we were going to get into this thing about breaking bones in the cast. And I wanted to sort of redirect the discussion. So I simply asked, so why do you think we need bones? Second graders. And Will said, you have to have bones or you would be like a jellyfish. Now, I'm going to give you 2 scenarios here, and you tell me where I did this story. Keokuk, Iowa, or Federalsburg, Maryland. Where was this story done? Maryland. Why? Jellyfish. See, you wouldn't hear that from an Iowa child, right? But around the Chesapeake Bay, where I live, in the Atlantic Ocean, you know, we have jellyfish, particularly in the summer when it gets really hot and they sting, and you know, have to put meat tenderizer on them and so on, kind of thing. And Dean says, so kids respond, what? Based upon their culture and their environment and so on. You couldn't stand up, you just flop over. And I said, are there different kinds of bones? I asked, rather, are there different kinds of bones? And Charlie said, some are straight and I think some are bent or curved. And then Darren, he begins to ask a question. Good sign, see? Is your skull a bone? And I said, what do you think? Rather than saying, yeah, it is. I said, what do you think? And Darren said, well, it's hard, so maybe it is. And I say, what else? In other words, tell me more. And Sierra says, we have lots of bones. Everybody does. And then on the next page, what do you think the follow-up question is? How many is a lot? When kids say that you got a lot of bones, you got a mess of them, you say, how many is a mess? Okay? We think about maybe 20, but some of us think a lot more. We think about 100 bones. And then I say, do we have all of our bones when we're born? Now that looks like it may be coming out of left field, but and Sierra says, ooh, good question. In other words, she knows it's a good question, okay? And Gabby said, I don't think you would have all of your bones when you're born. There isn't room, you know, and the kids sort of laughing and so on. And the point of the thing is that, okay, I'm a novelty in that classroom, although I spent time in that school, but they were enjoying themselves. They were having a good time learning. What else? We talked about whether your teeth are bones. And I said, what do you think? And Tom says, we think they are, but we're not sure. And Zane said, we think they are. And then I said, what's inside of bones? Anything inside of bones? And Maria says, are they hollow? Some birds have hollow bones. Now what she's doing, she's using what she knows over here to predict about what's over here and so on. And Eddie said, I think there's something inside. I'm not sure, but I think it's important. Let's find out. Now they had raised these questions, and this is what they read, and I'll give you a chance if we want to pass this out, Liz, real quickly. This is the text they read. Let's send it over this way, and 2 here, and Ron. And when you get it, just remember the discussion we've just had. Okay. Got a copy? Oh, you don't have a copy
yet.
All right. Because I just said to these second graders, and there were about 7 in the group, by the way. Let's find out, okay? Now, as you read this, what's happening? The synapses are just firing, aren't they? Oh, yeah, there's the answer to that. Oh, here's the answer to that. Oh, that's something we didn't. You see, you're truly interacting with the text. And you people aren't listening to me. You're not paying attention to a word I've said. You're reading, okay? And you're on the text and you're focused and so on. So, anyway, you can read the whole thing while I'm talking if you want. But I had some choices here. I could have said to my kids, here's an article on bones I want you to read, and then we'll talk about it. But I didn't start with the text. I started with what's in the heads of, and I certainly didn't originate that. And there's the answer to that question. You have more bones. Why did I ask that question? You have more bones when you're born than, when you're an adult. How many bones? Oh, it's 206. What's inside of bones? And so when they finished, and it didn't take long, And this is a case where I think if you looked at fluency, you'd see fluency perked up a little bit because kids are reading aggressively rather than passively. This is a post-reading discussion. I said to them, by the way, this is almost verbatim. I said to them, what did we learn? Simple question. What am I saying to the kids? If you read something, you ought to get smarter, right? What did you learn? And several students in unison said lots. That's music to a teacher's ear. Lots. Okay? And I said, for example, I should have put a question mark there. And Gabby said, you have all the bones when you're born. You know? And I think Gabby had talked about that. Actually, you have more bones when you were born. And Maria said, or Marlo said, chuckling, my baby cousin has more bones than my aunt, you know, and she had a baby. So, and Zane said, we have 206 bones when we grow up. And Eddie said, there is something inside. It's called marrow. It makes cells. Now, remember who had predicted? Remember who had said, there's something in those bones. I don't know what it is, but there's something, and I think it's important. I think it was Eddie, right? Well, that was important to him. It said it made 2 million a second. That's amazing. Darren said, we found out about the skull. It's a bone. And I said, just one bone? And he said, I might have handled that differently. And Darren said, there are 8, I think, or 28. I wasn't sure. And I said, well, let's go back to the text and check. And then we went back to the text to clarify. And then we continued this discussion for as long as I wanted to continue it. And they would continue longer if I had allowed. But this discussion was energetic and rich because kids had learned something. They had discovered something, and so on. And so when they say that this discussion continues a lot. And the format, whoops, I used was a framework for post-discussion. And I use this framework, and it's in the book, and I used it when I was at Oakland, and so on. It's been around for a long time. I like to say to kids after they've read informational text, did we find the answer to our questions? Now notice that what that assumes. That assumes that students have questions before they begin reading. Okay? Which questions are still unanswered? What didn't we find the answers to? And when a second grader said it didn't say, and it doesn't say, that's an important form of comprehension. They metacognitively know that they haven't found it yet. Now they've got some options. They can forget about it, or they can go somewhere else and read more. Or what new questions have been raised? You know, think what we could do with this article if we wanted to go even deeper. You know, instead they create or produce millions of cells. Do they do that from the very beginning? Is it 1 million cells per bone, or is it 1 million cells for all those bones put together? You see, there's all kinds of questions that we could go on and answer. What did we learn that we didn't think about before we began reading? That's a really nice question, because sometimes kids will read and find the answers to their questions, but then you say to them, so what else did we learn? And that's a question that students really like. They'll say, well, another thing it said, or another thing I found out. By the way, there's a dissertation there, by the way. What's the most surprising or interesting thing you've learned? And what are you saying to your students? Information can be interesting. And you're asking them to make a judgment. This is all obvious to you, I know, because what did we learn by reading this text? What do we know now that we didn't know before we began reading? In other words, how much smarter are we now than we were before? Remember when I was talking to David Coleman and I was sort of bashing on him a little bit? Well, if you do this kind of thing, you don't have to worry about text-dependent questions. You see, if you say, here's what I knew before, and this is what I know now, and this difference is because I read, okay, I know that I'm measuring learning. Does that make sense to you, by the way? Another way of doing this is bones in our body. I'm a big fan of anticipation guides. And I've done this as anticipation guides, and you know, all bones are hard. Newborn baby has more bones than a grown-up. Now, what are kids going to say? No way, okay? And they're going to predict on these things and so on. And then we're going to talk about it before they read. I don't want to just do an anticipation guide and then say, let's read. I want to do an anticipation guide and say to the kids, let's talk about, you know, what we just did, okay? Let me stop here for just a minute and talk about football. Okay, and you say, Dorsey, why are you talking about football? Well, one of my favorite coaches, my son went to Michigan State. He writes about Michigan State football, and my wife went to Michigan State. So we're big Spartan fans. Are there any Michigan State people in here? Okay, no offense to you, Ann Arbor, Michigan people. And Mark D'Antonio is a terrific coach. And he's had terrific seasons at Michigan State. It used to be that Michigan State would beat Notre Dame and they'd turn around and lose to Central Michigan or Western Michigan. You know? They didn't win the games they were supposed to win, and they just broke your heart. Well, not since D'Antonio's been there. But in 2011, D'Antonio's record was 11-2. In 2012, it was 7-6. And in 2012, he said, we're inches away from being a really outstanding team. Okay, notice what he said, we're inches away. He said, we're going to work on inches. Our offensive linemen have got to hold their blocks about a half a second longer. Our wide receivers have got to just get a few more inches separation between themselves and defensive backs. Our linebackers have got to close a little bit quicker. We're going to work on inches. What happened the next year? They went 12-1 or 13-1. They beat Ohio State for the Big Ten championship. And they beat Stanford in the Rose Bowl, and that was a particularly well-skilled team because he worked on inches. And I think in teaching sometimes we need to think about inches, you see. And it's not that, sometimes it's miles, but a lot of times we can just sort of jiggle a methodology a little bit and make it twice as powerful. So think about working on inches. How effective is this? Well, the late Bill Devers, who was a doctoral student here, did some studies, and I helped him a little bit. And we did anticipation guides with 4th and 5th grade kids in Milford and in East China, Michigan. And what we found is we were able to double comprehension. You know, with one treatment group, we taught them vocabulary, we gave them an overview, we told them. In the other group, we did an anticipation guide. And then we doubled comprehension. Now, what do you want to call that doubling comprehension? But clearly, we were getting deeper, and we were getting closer. So anticipation guides, when done well, are very, very effective. Two major, and I don't use anticipation guides for literature. Some people do. But to me, that's an informational text strategy. But that's me. You may figure out how to use them in ways I've never thought about. And this is a slide I pulled out from a Maryland presentation because this kind of conversation was going on in the state of Maryland. Because some people were beginning to suggest that maybe prior knowledge is not a good thing after all. Maybe you should just read what the text said. And I was actually hearing this in the state of Maryland. And I'm saying this represents a misunderstanding of how learners learn and how to address the text-dependent versus prior knowledge issue. Does that make sense to you? Of course, and David Pearson really did a nice job of sort of educating David Coleman on this issue. And he said, David Coleman, you can't read without prior knowledge. You can't construct meaning. So don't look at it as a bad thing. Look at it as a powerful thing that is used. The second thing is we engage in multiple readings for different types of processing. Let me tell you a story. I got a book from Corwin Press about 3 months ago, and the editors asked me if I would review this text and do a review of it. And I looked at it, and I spent a while with it, and I thought, I can't give this text a good review, rightly or wrongly, because the author, and you would recognize the name, the author said, first you read to get what the text says, and then you go back and read to interpret it. And then you go back to read and evaluate. You follow what I'm saying? So there are people who are sort of scrambling to figure out how to deal with this and so on. Maybe right, not my view. And what I say is, we cannot yes?
I've got a question about that first myth. Earlier, you told us about how sometimes preconceptions, people can come with preconceptions, they can sit through a lesson and nod their heads and say yes, yes, but then later on, they didn't learn what you were trying to get across. They're stuck on their preconceptions. How would you reconcile that with research?
When we look at, in science, they've done a lot of work on conceptual change theory. We find that when we have kids predict, or adults predict, at any age, that seems to open up the whole thing to some possibilities. And so you predict that, I used this article called Fruit Bats, John, which I think you've probably seen, where I asked whether fruit bats, you say they're probably blind, and they use echolocation. And then when you read the text, it says, unlike other bats, fruit bats do not use echolocation. And people read that and say, oh, how about that? And because they had predicted incorrectly, the contrast, and the difference is they're really reading it. I think a lot of people, when they're shaking their head, are not thinking about it that much. Do you follow what I'm saying? You know, and it's more complicated than that, but you know, that's a simple answer. The conceptual change research, we have not had trouble with conceptual change in general, because, as I say, I'm repeating myself, when you have kids predict, that just opens up possibilities, and I think it opens up the mind to different possibilities. So then when something comes across that is different than what you thought it was, you say, oh, how about that? I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And I think it sets up a contrast. Does that make some sense to you? Okay, and that's not a complete answer, but back to the second one, we cannot compartmentalize the behaviors of the mind brain in this manner. We can't just look at something and then go back later and interpret it. We do both. My background is agrarian. I grew up on a farm. They say you can take the boy off the farm, you can't take the farm out of the boy. That's me. I'm still in love with farming and so on. And I ride down the road, and the town I live in, right down the road, we live outside of town about a mile, right outside of town is a huge farm with beautiful cornfields. And I'll ride down the road, and I'll say, that corn looks good, but it's going to need some rain in a couple of days. In other words, I'm interpreting right away. I don't ride down the road to go in town in the morning and say, oh, there's corn. And then the next time, you know, that corn needs rain 2 hours later. You know, I'm interpreting from the very beginning. And I'm saying, if it doesn't get rain soon, but, you know, it's got a good stand there. And see, the mind, I think, starts interpreting as soon as they perceive. Okay? So this idea of saying, and by the way, this book's going to come out. Okay? We'll have some interesting discussions. Okay. Now look at this. Bones are, a lot of you use KWL charts, and I'm very fond of Donna Ogle. She's a wonderful person and so on. And I'm not anti-KWL. But here's a typical KWL. We say to the kids, we're going to do bones in our body. What do you know about bones in the body? And the kids say, we have bones in our body. Bones are hard. They say bones can break. Bones are important. Milk is good for bones. And then you say, what do you want to learn? And the kids say, how many bones do we have? I want to know what makes them hard. Why do bones break? Why are bones important? What else is good for bones? There's not bad questions, but it's sort of flat. What I want to say to the kids, let's talk about this. You say you want to find how many bones in the body. How many bones do you think there's in the body? And as soon as they begin to commit themselves to some possibilities, you raise the stakes. What makes bones break? Why are bones important? And the kid said, well, if you didn't have bones, you'd be like a jellyfish, you know, kind of thing. But I want to change it by inches, you see. I want to have that discussion. It's not just, here's what I want to find out, but here's what I think the answers might be. Here's what I think I might discover. Does that make sense to you? So the teacher's doing KWO. I'd like that teacher walking around and saying to kids, rather than just on a handout, so how many bones do you think we have? Do you have all your bones when you're born? The kid said, I don't know. You say, what do you think? And so on. And just modifying it by inches. Here's another one. Teacher, remember Mark D'Antonio? We're going to work on inches, right? We're going to be reading about bones in our body. Let's predict on what you think we will learn. And student says, 1, we will probably learn why bones are important. 2 says, we'll probably learn how many bones we have. 3 says, we'll learn the different kinds of bones. 4 says, we'll find out what makes bones grow. And 5 says, we'll learn why bones break sometimes. Well, that's not bad. But here's the problem as I see it. They're predicting on the wrong issues. Do you follow what I'm saying? Does that make sense to you? They're just following about, you know, what they're going to learn rather than the answers they're going to get. And you just tweak it a little bit. So the teacher says, you know, Dr. Hammond, I had a class from you and one from Ron Kramer and one from Chip Shepard, and I use prediction all the time. And it just doesn't work for me. Well, maybe one of the reasons it doesn't work is because we need to tweak it just a little bit. Does that make sense? And I think in our teacher education, and by the way, it's teacher education and not teacher training. We train dogs and horses. We educate people, okay? So And we used to use teacher training, and I understand we used to use nurses training, but it's nurses education, it's teacher education, and so on. Now, where was I after I made that snide remark? Anyway, we want to change. Oh, I would show examples to my undergraduates, or even my graduate students, and say, how could we make this more powerful? How could we make this more engaging? What could we do here? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about metacognition, and I know I'm being like my dad and sort of talking to you today because time is, but I only get one chance with you folks, you know. I'm going back to Florida tomorrow, assuming it's not going to snow tomorrow. This is in the book. I know as a good fifth grade reader in West Bloomfield, I begin with what I already know, okay? I always try to make sense of what I'm reading. And we sort of assume that kids understand that, but maybe they think that reading is about sounding good, right? We need to talk about that with them. I read with a purpose. I know why I'm reading, what I'm reading to find out. You walk past a fifth grader on Monday and you say, Brian, what are you reading to find out? And he's like, I don't know, I'm just reading. Well, how does he know when he's found it? And by the way, a very good question to ask kids generically before they begin reading, or even high school students. What are we going to be reading to find out? Now, they don't have to give us a dissertation, but they should have some notion of where they're headed. I ask myself questions before, during, and after reading. And kids say, Dr. Time, you do that all the time? And I said, probably not. But if I'm really engaged, I'm saying, okay, what do I know about this? Okay, is this making sense? What have I learned? I'm asking myself questions. I think about what will happen next in my story, if it's literature. In other words, what's going to happen to that bear? Why are they going up that tall building, etc.? Or how many, in nonfiction, informational, how many bones do I have in my body? And what's inside of it? I know as a skilled reader, I often read the text or parts of the text 2, 3, or more times in order to understand what I'm reading. You know, it's like the revision process in writing in a way, isn't it? Think of revision. The first draft doesn't do it. And in many cases, first draft doesn't do it in reading. Here's one from the book. It's Gary Paulson, Metacognition. I'm going to just, it's in the book, it's on your handout, but I think it's a good example of kids thinking about their own thinking. Again, it's a real example. So what have we observed here? I think we're okay on time. A lot of talk by students. An incredible amount of talk going on. Now, it's not random talk, it's focused talk, right? Minimal talk by teachers. We found, as we looked at some lessons, that if the teacher's doing more than 50% of the talking, it's probably not a very good lesson. So maybe today I haven't done a very good lesson, but you know, we'll do some exceptions in your case. Teachers ask inviting questions. Not assessment questions, but think about that. What else? Okay? What would you know, it's very inviting, it's invitational. Minimal modeling from the teacher. I think we're overusing modeling in our pedagogy. Watch me while I do it. It's okay to do that once in a while, but if you look at a teacher's manual, and some don't use those manuals, but model this for the children, model that for the children, model this for the children. Yeah, so if you go up to Clarkston to take tennis lessons, and the instructor says, let me show you how I play tennis, right? And let me model for you. Well, a little bit of modeling, but pretty soon, what do you want to do? You want to get a hold of the racket and hit the ball yourself. And actually, you should start that way. And then you try it first, and then the instructor comes in and says, well, try it this way. Let me show you. You see, it's not only too much modeling, but sometimes it's too early. Focus on the story. Minimal distractions. Okay. Look at many model lessons in textbooks, both textbooks for teachers at the university and teachers' manuals. And they will start a story, and then they'll stop and teach something about metaphor or simile and so on. And then they'll read another page, and they'll stop and teach something about foreshadowing. And then they'll read, and Linda's shaking her head back there, and then they'll read something else, and then the teacher will stop them again. And the poor kids, by the time they finish the story, I'm overstating the case, by the time they finish the story, they don't realize they've read a story, okay? And we are using stories too much to teach skills, you know? Don't be offended by what I'm going to say to you, okay? But I want to write an article called, Let Me Eat My Damn Pie, okay? I don't know about you, but I love apple pie, okay? Now, I don't eat it very often. It looks like I do, but I don't eat it very often. So I get a really good apple pie, and I've got this slice of pie, okay? And just as I start to bite in, the doorbell rings. So I go to the door, and somebody wants to drop something off, and that's fine. You know, it's warm apple pie. And then I come back and I sit down, and Joan wouldn't do this, but she'd say to me, before you eat your pie, would you take the garbage out? So I take the garbage out to the garbage can, okay? And then, you know, I start back to the story, and my cell phone rings. And I look at it, oh, it's my son. I better take that call, okay? And I keep interrupted 5 times. By that time, I'm not enjoying the pie. Does that make sense to you? And we have to let kids enjoy the pie. And the pie is the literature, the story, the kinds of things we talk about here. The excessive accessing of preconceptions for expository text. Predictions strategically used. We can over-predict. And sometimes we just pass out the books and say to the kids, enjoy this story. You know, the relatives came or lost. Just read it, and you know, we're not even going to talk about it unless you want to talk about it, and so on. But sometimes I want to sit down with a group of kids and I want to guide them and direct them through that story in a social constructivist way. An atmosphere of acceptance, reflection, and civility. You know, what do you think about that? You know, talk about that some more. So I know that sounds touchy-feely, but believe me, it's important. Okay, opportunities for deep comprehension. And I think we've done some deep comprehension today, but let me give you a couple examples. A story I used here for years is a story about crocodiles, and some of you remember that story. And we have kids predict, what do you know about crocodiles? And one of the things we have them predict on is how much they weigh and how big they get. And kids predict on them. So after the story, excuse me, you say to the kids, so did you find out about the size? And they said, well, they're usually only 6 to 8 feet, but they have been known to get up to 12 to 15 feet. And then you say to the kids, what about weight? And they say, even college students, undergraduates, will say, it didn't say. But you see, it does say. Because if you go on to paragraph 9, which is about 200 words later, the text says, when the eggs hatch, the baby crocs, each buried under at least a foot of dirt, began peeping loudly. On hearing the sound, the mother scratches with her front legs and jaws to remove the dirt cover. And then she picks up the hatchlings, each weighing about 4 ounces, one by one, and gently carries them to the beach. Okay, and then later on it says, paragraph 11, if one remembers that the weight, see there's a lot in between, keep in mind. If one remembers that the weight ratio, thanks to the weight ratio to the adult, the hatchling can be as much as 4,000 to 1. You see, so what I want my 6th graders to do is take the information in paragraph 9 and combine that with the information in paragraph 11 and come up with the fact that crocodiles do weigh 1,000 pounds. That's what I call a text-based inference. Texts are filled with those. And I think we're not. Does that make sense to you? I think we're not. So the only reason I use that article anymore is to simply illustrate that point. And there's another example in the book about that kind of thing, but fierce man-eating crocodile. And there's a number of ways of doing that. I could even tell my 7th graders or 6th graders, well, when I read the text, I came up with 1,000 pounds. How do you think I got it? I don't know, Mr. Chairman, you're the adult. No, but you can do that. How do you do it? Another one, the Gettysburg Address. And I remember in probably 8th grade memorizing the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers set forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, look at the first 2 or 3 stanzas, 77. And somewhere before this lesson is over, I want to say to the kids, and it's not the most important thing, how many years ago was that? Well, you see, unfortunately, the text has already told us. But take that away, expunge that. And I would say to my 7th graders, what's 77? Well, they say, you know, It's 7. How many years is that? They say, 7. Well, what is that? Well, what does it say there? Our fathers set forth on this continent a new nation. Now, this speech was written in 1863, or spoken in 1863. My kids know that from their social studies class. When did this nation start? 1776. Now, let's do a little bit of math. 1860, go ahead and do it. 1863 minus 1776. What do you come up with? Go ahead, do it. How many years you come up with? 87. Sure. Now, it's easy to just put down the bottom, it's 87 years. But we're missing an opportunity to teach kids about thinking that they can use when we're not there. I want kids to say, and by the way, 87 years, so 4 score minus 7, okay? So so 4 into, so how much is a score? 20. So 4 times 20 plus 7, 87 years. So there we're integrating mathematics, we're doing inferential thinking and so on. And I don't want, so there are all kinds of opportunities where I think we enable kids not to think, you see. And we want to use this opportunity to teach them how to think. By the way, I tell you what I would do with this 4 score and 7. If I'm teaching 6th grade or 7th grade, I would divide my kids up into about, let's say there are 27 kids, I would divide them into about 9 groups of 3. And 3 groups would take the first third, and the other 3 groups would take the second third, and the other group would take the third third. And I'd have to sit down and talk through what Lincoln said. What does it mean? Now we're engaged in now we gave our last full measure. What does that mean? You know, the kids say, well, it means they're dying. But you see, I memorized Gettysburg Address, but I never really, until later, took the time to understand it. So sometimes you just take a piece of text and you say to the kids, and you know, the Common Core people recommend this kind of thing. Take a piece of text and just sort of take it apart and interpret it. What does it mean in 2015 language? Whether it's a wonderful speech by Martin Luther King, whether it's a wonderful speech by John F. Kennedy or Churchill or whomever. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities. The most important thing is to understand the Gettysburg Address and what Lincoln meant. But in addition to that, I've got a nice chance here to teach kids how to think a little bit, real quickly. Seeking clarity. This is a case where there's just internal inconsistencies. You can look at it and see if you can figure them out.